Good morning. Welcome to the second day of Urban Arc 2023, Cities in Flux. It's my pleasure to introduce the sixth panel for this year, Rethinking Dwelling, Housing Transitions in Indian Cities. Thank you for those of you who are joining us today at 9 in the morning, those of you in person and those of you who are joining online. Today we have a wide array of different papers that engage with the question of transition and flux through housing and dwelling. Some look at it through questions of timing and delivery. Some look at it through questions of the temporality of different needs for housing, the kind of influence the different actors exert on housing markets, through the evolution of housing policies, and through the question of methods and categorization. We're going to start with we're going to follow the order on the schedule, and I request each of the presenters to introduce themselves before they present as well. Every paper will have 12 minutes. And Rasha will help us keep time. Those of you who are presenting online, do look out in the chat box, for updates on time, and keep a lookout for that. And we'll take question and answers at the end of the session. So do hold on to your question and answers for those of you who are here in person, and for those of you who are joining us online, please do use the question and A box to address your questions to the speakers, and we'll collect them and have a round of questions at the end. And so we'll start with the first paper, Delayed Allotment, Denied Housing, Unravelling the Challenges of Low-Income Housing Delivery in Delhi. And I think, Malay, you will be presenting first online?
Yeah. I think Ismail will introduce, and then
So thank you so much for giving this opportunity, presenting our research finding in this prestigious conference. So I, Dr. Ismail Haque, fellow at ICRIER, and my colleague Malay Kotal is there. So basically, housing problem is a defining problem in the contemporary urban India as well as in global South. So existing research evidence provide evidence that the lot of policy interventions are there, but the housing problem remain as it is. Okay, so many research has found that there are a significant number of vacant houses in the cities, but beneficiaries are not willing to move these houses. So we are actually trying to see that the just opposite spectrum of the debate, that if beneficiaries are willing to move these particular houses, then what is the constraints? Okay, what is the barrier for not getting the possessions of those houses in time? So these are the main research questions we are actually trying to decode in this study. So Malay will be presenting the detailed study. So over to you, Malay.
Yeah. Thank you. So as Ismail introduced the topic, basically this is kind of, we are trying to understand the problem, but by framing it in different way. So before getting to the detail, I think the context is very important. So if you go by the number, in Indian context, there is 1.2 lakhs around, houses which are physically unallotted so far, or we can call it as vacant house. And among different states, Delhi is one of the, largest chunk of those houses, and which number is around 34,000. And the most interesting part, or the sad part about it is, it's acted as a kind of black box. Whenever there is a debate of eviction or resettlement, this 34,000 number will be presented as a something which will save everyone. So if there is a eviction, when it was happening at the time of railway basti eviction, this 34,000 number will came up, or anything else. So we just try to unpack, like, are these houses is actually vacant, or if these are vacant, why it is vacant? The simple answer could be it's not allotted by the authority to the people. But then why the houses is not allotted? The next question is come up. So to understand that, we get into the detail of 3 such settlement in context of Delhi. And if you go by this 34,000 number, most of the houses are located in the periphery of the city. but I'm not getting to the debate of the center and periphery in this particular presentation. So as you can see, the most of the houses is located either Bhawana, Narela, or those outskirts of the city where industrialization happens, and some amount of resettlement also happened in the past. And so these houses actually built under previous schemes where the state actually took responsibility with the private sector to build houses, and 10 years down the line houses are still vacant, unallotted. And if you go to those particular sites, you can see up 10 years down the line houses are not in a situation that people can move directly to the such houses, because the all kind of infrastructure and other aspect of that particular neighborhood is deteriorating over time. So to understand this, we just get into the detail or the timeline of 3 such informal settlement in Delhi. First one is the Kidwai Nagar. The next one is Punjabi Academy, which is kind of, we can call it as a transit camp, because the Gole Market Basti was earlier evicted and shifted to this Punjabi Academy. Then they are still waiting to get the final allotment. And the third one is Noor Nagar Basti. And these 3 settlements are very dissimilar in terms of their own trajectory, because Kidwai Nagar faces multiple eviction. In case of Punjabi Academy, they already evicted, they are waiting in the transit camp. And Noor Nagar Basti, in case of Noor Nagar Basti, it is never face any kind of eviction, but it's under constant surveillance, because people can't change any part of their structure or anything within the settlement. So to understand what is the timeline of event that took place in 3 settlements, so we talked to several stakeholders like resident, like activist, local politician, lawyer, and also government official, and also get into this, done some study about the secondary literature and the database. So I just so this is the case of Kidwai Nagar Basti, which is located just beside of the Nala, and every time flooding happen, people their houses submerged in because of this flooding thing. And in this particular case, they are waiting more than 10 years to get rehabilitation, and people are ready to move. This is actually said by the people, considering the situation they are facing every year at the time of flooding. And this is the timeline of incident that took place in case of this particular Kidwai Nagar Basti. So, we just try to, although it looks like a linear set of events, but just to try to understand the structural thing behind it. In case of Kidwai Nagar, the Basti actually, people settled there in 89. Then after that, first one of the important thing happened that actually changed that dynamics of the Bastis, that demolition that took place around 2010 in Commonwealth, at the time of Commonwealth game at Delhi. And then some of the people actually receive, after that they go to the court, then they establish their eligibility to get rehabilitation, then some of them actually receive the provisional allotment letter, but since then still they are waiting. There are multiple survey happen in between, and people submitted the money that they need to pay for the rehabilitation, as well as they also verify all the document, but every time they go to the DUSIP office, the official will say yes, we are in the process, somewhere down the line we'll get the allotment, but nothing happen actually end of the day. So similarly, in case of this Punjabi Academy, which is kind of, we call it as a transit camp. So the demolition happened around 2010, and then people moved to this particular sites, Punjabi Academy, around 2014-15. Since then, they also fought in the court. They established their eligibility. Then they are still again waiting in the process of getting the allotment. In case of Noor Basti, this is little different because it's never faced any kind of eviction. Although in around 2009 there was a rumor or some action taken by the authority, but because of the local MLA's intervention, the eviction was stopped. But since then, people can't change their structure. It is located, just beside Jamia Millia University, and university claim the land is belong to the university. So whenever the resident try to change any kind of, they try to repair or kind of retrofit the existing structure, university authority come with their security guard to prevent them. So they are, also in a kind of limbo. They can't, neither they move to the rehabilitation site or neither they can change their existing structure. So which makes them, situation more vulnerable. And so then the next big question is like, what are the factors actually causing the delay in the allotment thing? So to understand this particular thing, we just try to, analyze three different types of event that took place in three different settlement. We compare it, their timeline, to understand the structural factor behind it which causing the delay. So the first thing that emerged as a striking features is the confusion around the ownership of the land. So in case of any kind of rehabilitation, government or authority give the logic because they want to use the land for some other purposes, which is for public interest, that is more important. But on the other hand, the other important aspect of is like if some government authority claim the land is belong to them, then the authority need to pay some amount of money for this purpose of rehabilitation to the nodal authority, which is DUSI, for actually to execute the rehabilitation thing. So when there is a confusion around the ownership thing, that causes large amount of delay in the process of allotment. So which happens in case of Kidbai Nagar. So the Kidbai Nagar Basti, which now NBCC claim the land is belong to them. At the beginning they denied that this land parcel is not belong to us, so we will not pay the money for the allotment thing. Then later on with the court intervention, NBCC agreed. 7-8 years down the line, they accept that the land is belong to them and they are ready to pay the rehabilitation, the money that is required for this rehabilitation purpose. So this confusion around ownership of land is one of the important thing which is causing delay in terms of allotment of houses to the intended beneficiaries. The second point that emerged throughout comparing these three different trajectories of event that took place in three different settlement is multiple round of survey and without any tangible outcome. So what this survey creates several effect in terms of local dynamics within the Basti. So first of all, when survey happens, some people they become eligible. Some people who are not in the Basti or they are in their work site or they move to their villages, sometimes they are not able to present at the time of survey because most cases survey happen without any prior notice. So then what happens, those who become eligible, they feel happy, like they expect they will get some rehabilitation thing down the line, but people who actually not qualify for this rehabilitation, they move to court to establish the rehabilitation thing, to establish their their eligibility for rehabilitation, which causes further delay because one group become eligible but they wait for the other group to prove their eligibility in front of the court, which causes the further delay. The other outcome of this particular multiple round of survey is it's create confusion within the settlement because it's divide the entire Basti into several groups. Some part of the Basti will be ready to move and some other part of the Basti will feel this is they don't want to go to the peripheral part of the city. So it's changed their internal dynamics. It also breaks the unity within the settlement because this is in case of Noornagar Basti, one of the Basti Pradhan told us in case of Noornagar Basti, earlier people were very happy, they try to cooperate with each other, but after multiple round of survey, it's create some tension within the Basti because those who don't want to move, they started to fight against the people who are willing to move to the outskirts of the city. So the third thing is related to the lack of coherence in the policy guideline. So in case of Delhi, there is the cut-off date to become eligible for rehabilitation also change over time. which act as there is also advantage to change in the criteria of this particular thing. There are also disadvantages. For instance, in case of Kidwai Nagar, when the new Rehabilitation Act was introduced in 2015, those who were earlier not eligible for rehabilitation, they become eligible. But some cases it also creates the delay, because those who become newly eligible due to change in the policy guideline, they need to go through some process of scrutinization of the document. They need to verify all different things, which causes the delay, because those who were earlier eligible under the previous guideline of 2010, they wait till the end. People who become eligible under 2015 actually finish their process of scrutinizing thing. The fourth thing that is related to this particular delay is the conflict in terms of taking the credit. So in case of Delhi, it's a conflicting overlapping kind of governance structure exists. So there is always a tension between the state and the center, who will takes the credit, because somehow it's related to the election campaign or election promises that people will get houses if their party come to the power. So same thing happened in case of Delhi. The recent most this particular conflict happened around this newly introduced the rental housing scheme. So the houses which were previously built for this rehabilitation purpose for the low income group or economically weaker section, now the central government wants to convert those houses into rental thing. But people who already established their eligibility, those who already paid their money for getting rehabilitation, they don't want to stay in the rental accommodation right now. But center is saying all of those 34,000 houses need to be converted into the rental thing. But the state government is saying we already committed to large chunk of the people that will give them house. So we can't, convert the entire 34,000 into the rental thing. So this contradictory, interest or the claim is also causing the delay in case of allotment. And the last one is related to pandemic, because at the time of pandemic, people are like, there is always a guideline, government guideline, that you should stay inside of the house. But in case of this particular 3 settlement, it's very difficult to be inside in the houses considering their current situation. Then later on, when all other activities started within the city, this allotment thing got delayed by using this logic of this pandemic. So Basti resident actually told us, so जब election होता है तब ठीक है, तब सब कुछ normal है, but जब allotment का बारी आता है, the official will always use the logic of this particular COVID thing. So this, so all this, takes us.
Sorry to interrupt. We're running out of time. So if you could.
Just wrap up.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the first striking features that emerge, the people always focus on the construction of new houses, but what about delivery of such houses and time with a timeline, which is very important. And the next thing is vacancy. Although these houses looks physically vacant or unallotted, but it actually preoccupied by the multiple contradictory claims. And this leads to the third thing is, like, if we delay in the allotment process, it's actually denying the rights people who are waiting, who already established their kind of eligibility in the process after waiting 10 years, they are denied from their access or their right to the houses. The fourth one is this housing crisis, always interpret as a mismatch between the demand and the supply, and this market dynamics always people talk about. But what about these institutional factors which also can contribute to delay in the process of allotment? So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Malay, for that, and thank you for highlighting. The experience of waiting and transition and what that means for people and the various factors that contribute to it. We'll come to question and answers at the end. For now, we'll move on to the next paper, Investigating the Need for Student Rental Housing in India. And Dikchha, over to you. Please switch on the mic. Thank you.
Hi. The topic of my presentation is investigating the need of policy for student rental housing. So the motivation behind this presentation was through some of the big questions that we have through these national newspaper headlines, where students faced major issues from their university when they could not accommodate them through their hostels. So in terms of like most of the newspaper highlighted, some even highlighted to the dropout ratios of students who could not be accommodated in hostels, or housing problems arose in their cities because of limited private housing stock as well. So if we look at some stats in terms of Indian scenario, we have like 37.8 million students are studying in terms of higher education institution, which is just the formal data. We are not even talking about those enrolled in coaching institutes in Delhi or Kotal or any such city. And almost 75% of this population is living away from their home, and only 18 to 20% of their housing need is catered through the institutional hostels, while and roughly approximately 1,48,000 beds are available in formal private market to cater this need, and which is mostly operated through these 30 to 35 operators as given through the market research that we have till 2019. And if we see the age group of this population, which starts from 15 to 24, and even to the later age up till 30, 32, when people are pursuing their PhDs and all those programs, we see a steady rise in this population from through the census data from 1961 to 2011 that we have. There is a steady increase from 16% to 19% so far. And there are major drivers to this sector where we have rising student population and improving gross enrollment ratio through the new national education policies that we have. While there is a limited number of beds, and there is also increasing spending capacity of the people in terms of better quality of housing or living, we can say. The rental housing that we have in terms of policy, we are targeting upon the special groups in our country. We have moved from an ownership-based housing to rental housing in terms of policy, where we are highlighting the need of need-based rental housing. And this is in this policy, it is highlighted that this student need is usually from 6 months to 5 years. But we barely look into this aspect of housing, which is mostly catered through, private hostels or paying guest accommodation that is here, which is an informal market that is there. We studied different rental acts of 27 states and compared them, and we got very limited information in terms of such short duration stays or need-based rentals. Although there is a generalized tenancy that has been defined in these acts, but none of these documents talks about such need-based tenants, and what are the demography that we have or the profiles that we have of these tenants. And mostly these student clusters, or commonly known as student ghettos, are actually omitted from our urban development interventions. And there is a need to understand such development, not just at the premises level, but at the cluster level in terms of city, which is not addressed at a policy level. Then with the new coming up national education policy of 2022, there are certain highlights to this policy that tells us this demand is going to grow, where India is to be acknowledged as a knowledge power, superpower, that is to say. And we are increasing gross enrollment ratio from 26% that was in 2018 to 50% in 2035. Imagine the kind of demand that will increase in this sector. And there will also be a requirement of multidisciplinary university that will come not just at any city level, but at district levels itself. And we are also aiming towards high-performing Indian university. So the argument here is that, are we understanding the kind of demography changes that will happen in the student population itself through a kind of different multidisciplinary studies that we'll have in upcoming years. So we have some reflection of this need in the upcoming Delhi Master Plan of 2041, which recognized it in its objective 4, where it is trying to have a promotion of rental and provision of hostels and student housing close to the education centers, which is a major problem in Delhi. Most of the students in Delhi are outstation students, and they struggle with the housing. Me being a victim of it itself in my student years. And there is a need of housing that needs to be addressed. This is what is acknowledged in the master plan. And it also came up with a special focus towards medical college or veterinary institute, where it acknowledged giving minimum of 50% FAR to be allowed as a residential component for essential staff or attendants or the hostels for students. So in terms of category of student, we see in Indian market, we can categorize them as formal and informal. Formal are the ones that come up through institutions that are established under an act, that is schools and higher education institution. While informal are the ones which are mostly market needs, developed through market needs, which is the coaching for higher education institution, be it IIT, IIMs, and all those things, or for coaching institute, or I'm talking about UPSC candidates who come up in any city. And this study is mostly focusing upon from student who migrate to another city from secondary education to even the preparation for jobs and all. So in terms of role of student in urban change, we studied it through this phenomena of studentification. Now, what is studentification? It is a type of gentrification. Gentrification is when the influx of gentrifier or any actors who displace the permanent resident or the class of urban citizen who are there to another neighborhood. In this case, these gentrifiers are the student. So the process by which this neighborhood becomes dominated by student residentials and student influence the economy of the area is called the studentification process. If we see the definition of studentification, it is the urban change which are tied to the recommodification of single family or repackaging of the existing private rental to small scale institution actor to produce housing for multiple occupation or for higher education institute. So it has various factors. Economically, it talks about revalorization and inflation of property prices, which is dominated by private rented. Socially, it talks about replacement of permanent resident with transit to young and single living population. Culturally, it talks about share culture, lifestyle, which is more towards youth side in terms of retail and service infrastructure. Physically, it talks about upgrading of the external physical environment in the initial stage, while later on leading to degrading or downgrading of the physical environment. So when we talk about, it has certain waves of studentification. It does not happen, it happens eventually, where the first wave talks about establishment of higher education institution and thereby upcoming of housing for multiple occupation people that are there. In this case, we have students. And the second waves comes when there is expansion of the student population and proliferation of purpose-built student accommodation happens by the private sectors. And the third waves come when urban areas started to decline, and there is a deterioration in the living condition along with unauthorized development. It is between the second wave and the third wave that we need to come up with policy regulation. And in many cities, this is the need that we have. That in terms of positive impact, there is a physically it has shared accommodation, there is reduced vacancy and incentive for the property. Socially, there is a lot of youth that come up in the neighborhood. Culturally, there is interactive spaces that are there. Economically, it stabilizes to an extent the market that is there. In terms of negative, there is loss of qualitative housing, there is unstable property that happens. Socially, there is bitterness between the permanent resident and the student, and often of overcrowding happens. And culturally, there are many antisocial behavior that happens, and noise nuisance is a common phenomenon in this kind of neighborhood. And economically, it increases local informal business, and there is lack of family housing that happens. When we compare student zone with other zone, there, of course, there due to the dominance of young population, there are higher education colleges and all these places are there in such neighborhood. There is commercial activities which is specifically caters the young population, and there are purpose-built student accommodation and game zones, and all these kind of happening places happens in such zone. While in other zone we see a mixed and hierarchy of facilities that are there. So a lot of urban issues that cities are facing is in terms of substandard property condition. There is compromised habitable space, and there are a lack of natural ventilation and lights and all those things. Even some of the top institute faced a lot of issues in terms of catering their housing needs of the student during pandemic, which later on stabilized, but some of them are still facing it though. So a lot of, if we see observations around it, there is a concentration of some particular location zone, and often in cluster. Ancillary facilities come up and complementary mixed use happen. There is preferences and triggered for the in informal way, but planned studentification lacks these triggers. There are this demand needs and has an affordability limit, and it is not often recognized in the formal law system. There is safety and security issues. There are loss of revenue by the government just because this is not a formalized market. In Indian researchers also recognize the regularization of such rental market, and there is a need of affordable rental that needs to come up in the cities. So some of the cases that we see here is Roopnagar, Kamlanagar of Vijayanagar in Delhi, where there are nearly 92,000 students in this area, and a major housing transformation has taken from 1979 to 2019, where we see family housing has been converted into rooms and even got transferred to per bed living spaces, which has resulted in overcrowding. Similar cases have come up from Kotal side, where a lot of overcrowding and lack of public-private partnership is there, which is resulting in suffering in terms of quality of life. So we talk about different typologies of students that are there. Till now it has been managed through institutionally managed hostels, or sometimes own housing through relatives and all the known of the student, and the private housing market is the major caterer to this need. Then this is the typologies where we could identify that is present in the market right now. To conclude the study, we see that there is a need to understand these student ghettos, which is so formally been neglected through in the formal system, but recognized in the informal market. While as we move from housing for all to rental housing, there is also a need to understand this need-based housing options for the new migratory population that we have in our city. There is a need for regulation and development, in terms of public purposely built student accommodation, not just at premises level, but at cluster level. There, we need to come up with innovative rental models such as incentive FAR to solve the unsold inventories in the private housing market that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dikchha. That was very interesting and also pointing to a unique kind of group that we need to be thinking about with housing. I'm also curious about what how thinking about this may help us think about thinking about different forms of households, non-family based housing. And maybe we can come back to that in the question answer session. For now, we'll move to the third paper, Unaffordable Flats, the Paradox of Cooperative Housing Society in India. Varun will be presenting online. Varun, please go ahead.
Just a second. Yeah. Hi, thank you for having me here. My name is Varun Panickar. I'm a PhD student at the University of British Columbia in the Geography Department. And my co-authors for this paper are Dr. Priti Narayan, who's an assistant professor here in the Geography Department at UBC, and Dr. Paroma Wagle, who is a postdoc at the department. So before I get into the presentation, I just want to give a wider context for the paper itself and some of its objectives. So this paper is meant to be a contribution to a special issue on cooperative housing in the Housing Studies Journal, and it seeks to sort of cover the journey that cooperative housing has made in an Indian context, and intends to highlight the peculiar existence of cooperative housing in India. In this particular paper, we're sort of highlighting the paradoxical existence of cooperative housing in the country. I'll provide you with some context of what this paradox is that we refer to in the title of the paper. So all over the world, especially in the global north, cooperative housing is seen as an example of decommodified, degrowth housing, that is housing which doesn't have profit seeking as a motive. The emphasis within cooperative housing has always been on maintaining itself as an avenue of affordable housing outside the imperative of profit seeking, which dominates the mainstream housing market. With these characteristics, cooperative housing has only enjoyed a niche status in most of the global north. But in India, cooperative housing societies are the most common form of association amongst residents of apartment buildings in cities. However, the predominance of cooperative housing societies has not resulted in a stock of affordable housing in cities in India. To understand this the empirical expression of this paradox, we set this paper in the ecosystem of cooperative housing societies in Mumbai. We picked Mumbai because Mumbai is where the cooperative housing society is a form of association for residents of apartment buildings, more colloquially known as flats, began in India. It not only has the longest legacy of cooperative housing, but also has some of the highest real estate values in the world. In 2014, in its report on the state of affordable housing in Mumbai, the NGO Praja found that the average price of a 269 square foot dwelling in Mumbai cost an average of 28 lakh rupees. This while the average annual income of Mumbaikars was only 2.4 lakh rupees. We assume that these comparative numbers have only risen manyfold since then. To understand this paradox, we asked two questions. What is the institutional history of affordable cooperative housing in Mumbai? And how does the cooperative housing society in Mumbai interact? How does the contemporary cooperative housing society in Mumbai interact with the housing market? To answer these questions, we take a mixed methods approach. We examine primary and secondary sources, detailing the institutional history of cooperative housing in Mumbai, going back to its colonial roots in the Baloch residency, And the objective of this search is to trace the changing political economy surrounding the cooperative housing ecosystem in the city. We have also then conducted interviews with residents of a housing cooperative which has undergone redevelopment to elicit narratives of how members of the cooperative housing society themselves understand and view the financialization of their units in the cooperative. The institutional history of cooperative housing in India begins with the apartment building and its singular unit, the flat, which was introduced to the Bombay Presidency through the Bombay Improvement Trust's efforts to realize a cityscape in the agrarian suburbs of the colonial city in 1909-1910. Around the same time in 1910, a group of housing activists sort of seized upon the cooperative form to establish associations for these newly developed apartment buildings, and they allowed for members of their community to have an affordable way, to procure a unit in the building. S.S. Talmaki, who was one of the pioneers of the cooperative housing in Mumbai, developed a variation of the English and German forms of the co-ownership housing, also known as the building society model, to develop what was then called the tenant co-partnership cooperative housing society. This system made it affordable for members of the distinct community groups to acquire flats by requiring them to put down only a marginal amount, which was sometimes as less as 1/5 or 1/3 of the total cost of the flat, to purchase shares in the cooperative. The rest of the amount was to be paid off gradually as nominal rents. During this period, the main motivating factor for all these parties to come together was to provide stable long-term occupancies of flats in cooperative society. Thus, ownership, or rather individual ownership, was not a need for the residents or the promoters of the apartment in this early period of apartment buildings, and residents were satisfied with the rental arrangement that they had. It was only in the report of the housing panel of the committee, which was appointed to inquire into the Greater Bombay scheme in 1946, that this conceptual possibility of individual ownership of a flat in the cooperative framework was discussed. The report compared the tenant co-partnership model with a tenant ownership model, which had till then only been applied to plotted housing, and recommended a tenant ownership model for apartment societies as well. Despite this recommendation, providing affordable housing through flats in cooperative housing societies remained the focus of this setup. And to this end, the collective ownership and the degrowth motives of cooperative housing are what kept it out of the mainstream housing market. However, this scenario changed in the mid-1940s as a combination of political economy factors came together to induce a profit motive to cooperative housing, which finally culminated in the ownership flat. These factors did two things. They disincentivized rental housing, which had been the mainstay of the housing stock in Mumbai till then, and it created a perception of scarcity in the housing stock, which led to the rise of commercialization of the apartment and the ownership flat. The first factor was the rent control, which was imposed by the Bombay Rent Control Act of 1947, which placed restrictions on the timeline for investors to recoup their investments in developing apartment buildings. The second factor was the cement shortage in Mumbai at the end of the Second World War, which created a perception of a slowdown in housing production and fueled a perception that housing was scarce. These factors were compounded in a great way by a large influx of migrants to the city in the aftermath of the partition. These migrants who were looking for housing, initially all adopted the tenant co-partnership model and developed community-specific cooperative housing societies across the city. But at a certain point in the early 1950s, they devised a way of reversing the development process to commercialize it. They stepped out of the framework of developing affordable housing for community members. So individual promoters would then step forward, collect deposits from those interested in procuring an ownership flat, which is not restricted to members of a particular community. And then they would use those deposits to first buy the land and then collect deposits to develop various stages, or to rather fund various stages of the development process. All this was done under the ambit of the cooperative housing framework. Residents were still given shares and were still addressed as tenant co-partners, but in effect were individual owners of their flat. So that by the time C. Rajagopalan, who was a visiting professor from Punjab University and writing a report on housing in Bombay in 1964, by the time he was writing his report, he noticed that the apartment housing in the city was not cooperative housing at all, since it didn't have the cooperative spirit of a community coming together to provide affordable housing for themselves. The emphasis on ownership became even more pronounced because the state and the judiciary was then forced to step in and pass the Maharashtra Ownership Flats Act to sort of contend with a lot of the malpractices which were happening through the de facto ownership model. And this was the first time when the ownership flat was mentioned in legislation, which sort of cemented its status. This greatly weakened the status of the cooperative housing society itself as a viable avenue for provisioning affordable housing. The ownership flat sort of cemented a complete transformation in the cooperative housing framework and heralded a continuing tradition of wholly financialized cooperative housing. So this part of the paper sort of brings us to how ownership, individual ownership, and commercialized real estate was introduced to the apartment sector in Mumbai. For the second part of the paper, we're looking at conducting interviews with residents of a cooperative housing society, which has been redeveloped to sort of understand their own position as flat owners within a cooperative setup, a more contemporary position. We have to do this, so we are in the process of conducting interviews with members of the Vijayanagar Cooperative Housing Society, which is a cooperative housing society which was established by the Gandhi and Baburao Paranspe. And he was one of those earlier housing activists who, sort of set up cooperative housing societies to provide affordable housing for the Brahmin community in Bombay. And so, hope to sort of ask them questions which will reveal narratives of how they view the financialization of their unit. And so we can, sort of set that against some of the founding motives of the cooperative housing movement in India, which were to provide affordable housing. And since this is a working paper, I don't really have any conclusions at this point, but I'm hoping to get a lot of feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Varun, for that and for presenting an overview of how the shifting policyscape in the cooperative housing sector has also been contributing to the financialization of the housing market in Mumbai. The next paper is also from Mumbai, and I'd invite Panki Agarwal to present the Flux in Mumbai's rent control system, accommodating commodification in the decommodified rental sector.
Hello, yeah, I'm just beginning with the slideshow. All right. Okay. Hi, good morning from Mumbai. I'm Pankhi Agrawal, and I've recently defended my PhD at IIT Bombay at the Humanities and Social Sciences Department. And this presentation is partially based on my doctoral thesis. Now, Mumbai city has more than a century-long history of rent control. The first rent control, which was applicable to the city, was passed in 1918. And since then, it has been in force, except maybe for around 11 years. But the present-day rent control sector in Mumbai came to be formed under the Bombay Rent Act, which was a highly restrictive act. It was passed in 1947 and extended over 50 years. And led to the formation and expansion of a rent control sector, which is a multi-class, multi-ethnic, multi-ethnic protected tenant base, which is spread across a range of premises, from self-contained flats in the apartment buildings to tenements in Mumbai's chawls. All right. So these are just, some representations of the kind of premises in which rent control is applicable. Now, even at present, the tenants in this rent control sector continue to pay extremely low rents, are protected from economic eviction, and can pass statutory tenancy rights to heirs. Now, most of these rent control premises, including around 2.5 lakh residential units, are located in the island city of Mumbai, which is the oldest and southernmost part of Greater Mumbai district. Now, my doctoral work was focused on studying the field of contention which was created by the rent control system in the city. I was drawn to the sector by a curiosity. In principle, rent control is a measure of decommodification of housing, which, as Varun said, entails limiting the role of markets and profitability in the housing system. So then the question for me was, why do these market-inhibiting rent control protections survive in a city like Mumbai, where commodification of land and space has made such a generalized and normalized appearance? And particularly, how is it that this sector remains entrenched in a city like Mumbai, where urbanism has taken a neoliberal turn? To attempt an explanation, I looked at the role played by tenant struggles in seeking the introduction and defense of rent control. And I found much in the history to suggest that the city's tenants played a major role in defending rent control. But what was also becoming clearer to me in course of my work was that the political pressure was not the whole picture, nor was it an entirely vote bank issue, as some critics have called it. I came to develop this tentative explanation that a reason why rent-controlled sector survives in the city is because commodification has been accommodated both surreptitiously and in a more forthright manner into the making of this partially decommodified sector. I argue this on basis of a close reading of the laws underlying the city's rent control system. These include the rent control laws and the laws related to the repair and reconstruction of rent control buildings. Moreover, I have also tried to glean the legislative intent behind these laws through an analysis of the legislative debates on the rent control bills. And these debates I accessed at the Maharashtra Colonial Archives and the Vidhan Bhavan Library in Mumbai. Now, based on this research, I divide the century-long history of rent control system into 3 phases to highlight the changes in these laws, highlight the changes in the protective stance of these laws towards tenants. Now, before 1918, the tenant-landlord relations were governed by Transfer of Property Act. And this was a general law for regulating tenancies and did not really account for the power differences between the tenants and the landlords in fixing of the contract. Then 2 rent control laws were passed in 1918. This is against the backdrop of the First World War. And under these laws, rents came to be fixed at lower levels than market rates. Ceilings were specified for rent hikes, and the freedom of the landlord to evict a tenant was considerably curbed. But between 1918 and 1947, rent control was used mainly as an emergency measure to deal with the exigencies produced by the World War situations rather than a long-term policy of social welfare. Now, the welfarist phase begins with the passage of the Bombay Rents, Hotel and Lodging House Rates Control Act in November 1947, which I call the Bombay Rent Act. In the legislative debates on the 1947 Rent Control Bill, rent control was now no more presented as an emergency measure, but as a long-term social welfare policy, which had to be put in place due to a perpetual and worsening housing scarcity in the state's urban areas. Though there were differences over certain restrictive provisions, the dominant view was that rent control law should be unequivocally about the protection of tenants. Now, during the welfareist period, the standard rent was almost frozen, raised only once, and that too minimally for residential tenants. The courts and the state legislature came to allow inheritability of statutory tenancy rights, which effectively secured the legal enjoyment of rent control protections by succeeding generations of tenants' families. Now, the 1947 Bombay Rent Act applied to almost all premises owned and rented by private persons and used for residential and non-residential purposes. Moreover, between 1947 and 1973, through various amendments to the Bombay Rent Act, the ambit of protection was extended to newer sets of tenants. Now, another feature of this welfareist period was the passage of the Bombay Building Repairs and Reconstruction Board Act in 1969. Now, one of the problems faced by the rent-controlled tenants in these buildings was the dilapidating conditions of these structures, because the landlords continued to maintain that they didn't have enough funds to repair these premises because of the Rent Act. Now, the 1969 Act imposed a cess on the owners and occupants of these buildings, which was to be used for the repairs. Moreover, the state government also contributed to this repair fund, and a government-controlled repair board was set up to undertake the repairs and reconstruction. Now, this was a unique institutional arrangement of a socialist kind, which brought together the resources of mainly the tenants and the government to avert the collapses of the rent-controlled buildings. However, this rent control sector, even during the welfareist period, was imperfectly decommodified. A major way in which commodification seeped into this sector was through the practice of pagdi system. Now, it basically involves the selling of statutory tenancy rights by the sitting tenants to the new tenants for a lump sum amount. And around 1/3 to 50% of this amount is then transferred to the landlord for issuing the rent receipt in the name of the new tenant. Now, this practice was held illegal till 1999, but was quite pervasive. And this is how an entire market for buying and selling of protected tenant rights developed in the rent control sector. Now, the lawmaking around rent control also came to perpetuate commodification of rental sector through the legitimization of the leave and license system. This system emerged as a way for property owners, particularly in the cooperative housing society flats, to circumvent the Bombay Rent Act. It involves creating short-term tenancies for a maximum period of 11 months, and then these licenses are not subject to the restrictions under the Bombay Rent Act. It started to develop since 1960s, and then in 1973, it became a matter of contention in the state legislature. The debate was whether the rent control protection should now also be extended to these licensees. A 1973 amendment to the Bombay Rent Act was passed, which marks an ambivalent point in the history of rent control. It extended Bombay Rent Act protection to the existing licensees, but not to the licensees which entered the rental market thereafter. It also legitimized the practice of leave and license agreement, which until then was popularly seen as an unethical, underhanded practice. So post 1973, the leave and license practice was allowed to thrive, and the new renters were left to the vagaries of the rental market. And I see this as the beginning of the liberal phase of lawmaking on rent control. The developments from 1980s onwards mark a clearer shift in the legislative intent with regard to rent control. From protection of tenants, it now became about striking a balance between the interests of the tenants and the landlords. More crucially, it became about unleashing the accumulative potential of the real estate sector by assuring the investors that the freedom to draw returns would not be compromised by social policies. In 1947, Bombay Rent Act was amended to allow for the growth of a non-controlled rental market. And this trend was reinforced by the Maharashtra Rent Control Act of 1999, which replaced the Bombay Rent Act. In this way, the rent control laws and the lawmaking on rent control have contributed to a growing segmentation of the Mumbai's tenant base into statutory tenants who enjoy strong tenancy rights and the contractual tenants, mainly the licensees, who have wafer-thin rights. The liberalizing tendencies are also evident in the sphere of repairs and reconstruction. Since the late 1980s, the state government has gradually stepped out of its role of directly providing repairs to the rent-controlled buildings. A mounting number of incentives are being provided to private developers to take on the redevelopment of these buildings under the DCR 33-7. This has facilitated the penetration of corporate capital into reconstruction of rent-controlled buildings. In fact, one tenant activist, in an interview, he told me that the DCR 33-7 is the reason why the developer lobby is not pushing for decontrolling the rent control sector in the city. 33-7 exists because rent control exists. And this 33-7 DCR allows developers and builders to acquire prime land in the island city of Mumbai. Now, this history of rent control in context of Mumbai shows that rent control laws have not been unambiguously about decommodification of housing. Both critics and supporters think of rent control laws as having distorted and inhibited markets in the housing sector. What I have tried to show is that, yes, decommodification did take place, and at one point it was also expansive. That is, protections kept applying to newer sections of tenants. But this decommodification was imperfect given the Pagri system, and more crucially, rent control laws were used to legitimize the development of an uncontrolled rental sector. This history offers a window to analyze the limits and challenges of using social policies to defend use values of housing in a context where commodified notions of housing become embedded in law, policy, and in the moral discourse around urban citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you, Banki, for that and for taking us through the evolution of the rent control acts and how we've seen a commodification in the sector. I think later in the question answer session, it'd be really nice to see how understanding the cooperative policy landscape and its evolution and the rental control evolution, how they speak to each other and the pressures they exert on Mumbai's housing market. Then the next paper that we're going to look at is going to shift gear to methods. And Rohit, I invite you to present your paper, a method to measure perceived tenure security in low-income settlements in India. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot. First of all, thanks for this opportunity. My name is Rohit. I'm a consultant working in Mumbai and an independent researcher. So what I'm going to present today kind of builds on my dissertation during my master's at Bartlett DPU. And there are things which have evolved in process. So I'm gonna just present that. So before I start, one of the reasons why I kind of got interested in this topic is this curiosity about this idea of security. How does one define security, right? Like, it's very easy. The first go-to answer is that you show a rental document or some kind of a contractual agreement when we talk about a housing security or a land security. And this notion becomes much more complicated when we shift the lens from middle income groups to low income groups or much more marginalized population. So, okay. So, what is the context before I kind of set out? So one of the major issues in the way the whole land dynamics is defined is there is this complete shift towards titling or having an individual ownership. So there is this dualism where there is inability of a lot of households. They cannot provide the formal proof for the house ownership, and often this contractual agreements, they remain de facto. So there is this non-recognition of a range of land tenure and property rights. And it's one of the major reasons is because there's this dualistic way of thinking between just because someone has some form of a legal recognition in the form of a title that becomes secure and formal, as compared to someone who does not, that becomes informal and illegal. So I wanted to kind of complicate this concept because it is complicated, realizing my multiple interviews on ground and speaking to a range of people in different communities. So is land titling the only way for a secure tenure? And we need to move beyond the idea of continuum. And continuum is the idea which has been in focus, especially after the Hernando de Soto's Mystery of Capital and this whole promotion that once you have some document, you can rent, you can easily get a loan on it, you can sell it in the open market, and that's how the social mobility grows. So that was also taken by a lot of countries in their policies, and of course UN Habitat, this epitome where they said that there is this stepped up approach from informal land rights to formal land rights, and what you see in the end, the registered freehold, is the ultimate success. Like that's, you reach at a registered freehold and that is it, you have achieved. That was the promotion, like it's like a ladder, and this was problematic. So what was the conception I was building on? So tenure security is essentially not just de jure, right? So de jure tenure security is what we all know, right? It's like present, like reliance on presence of titles, documentation. So there is de facto tenure security where often the security exists, but it is not very much visible. A lot of it is implicit. And whether it is legal or not is not a question, but it has built over time and it varies from context to context. And the third, which is what my major interest is perceived tenure security. So it is more like a perception or what subjective assessment you have of this risk. And this can vary within a community also. It can vary across gender, across caste. Different castes living in the same settlement can perceive the idea of tenure security in that particular neighborhood in a very different way. So what is my aim? So what I'm trying to do, and it's a work in progress again, and so I'm trying to propose a framework for a non-linear method to gauge this perception of land and housing tenure security of the urban poor. And the larger idea is how it can then guide the decision-making of different interest groups, be it government, be it NGOs, community-based organizations, etc. So what is my framework? So the way I'm defining this is I'm determining a range of indicators that influence perceived tenure security. It is based on certain groundwork, and I was a part of the 2 years project with U Chicago Trust, where we, of course, the objectives of that were different, but I got a chance to do around 150 detailed ethnographic interviews over a period of 2 years in informal settlements in Mumbai and Jaipur and partially in Ahmedabad. And the intensity to which, and that is one of my major sort of inspiration, that how feeling of tenure security is not governed by one or two simple things. It is much more complicated and governed by a lot of legal, economic, socio-cultural factors. And of course, I'm building on Nancy Fraser's social justice framework, where she talks about this idea of redistribution and recognition. And it kind of just, the moment I started realizing this, that the idea of titling or the idea of giving something, some form of a tangible document, is so much about distributing. It is much more visible. It is very much politically glorious. But the moment we think from that, from a recognition perspective, a lot of it is intangible, it is implicit. It is in the smaller changes, the incremental changes in the way we define tenure security. So these are like this 10 indicators which I've tried to list. So they are different. We don't have time for going into the detail, but just I'll touch on 2-3 of them. So for example, habitat contribution. So what I mean by that is essentially, there are a lot of communities in different parts of the city where even if they might not have any defined tenure title, they will still invest in their houses because there is certain kind of a security which kind of exists, which might be much more implicit. For example, a local councillor in any community, if there is that dynamics which they know that no matter how things happen, if there is that dynamics which is strong enough, robust enough, they will not be evicted from that place. But that's not proven in some form of a writing. So those are like effectivity of solidarity networks. So often there are a lot of self-help groups, there are a lot of smaller CBOs in communities which are not recognized. For example, there's a settlement in Mumbai called Kaula Bandar, which is on central government land, Mumbai Port Trust. They have been not recognized by the state government for a long time, but they still exist from 50, 60 years. So there is some reason, and that's what I'm trying to assess. Then location primacy. There is a settlement in Jaipur, which is near the Nahargarh fort. And actually there can be no market which can actually go and it can, completely redevelop that because it is actually not tenable. And those people have gotten pattas by the Jaipur Development Authority. So you start seeing who gets the title, who does not get the title, what is the primacy of the location. And there is a basti right in the center of Jaipur next to Vidhan Bhavan, I think Katputli Colony. They still are fighting for the tenure, for the title, for the security. So these are the three sites, like Sarvodaya Nagar is in the Bhandup area of Mumbai, Ambujwadi is in Malad, Kola Bandar. And all these three sites are very different from the, so I'll just like right now from the visual. So Sarvodaya Nagar is much more robust. It has all the access to basic services. Then Kola Bandar is on central government land, which I was just talking about. Ambujwadi is in the Malad, and there's a part of it is recognized and part of it is not. And you can actually make a difference in the way people have invested in the houses. So yeah, like this is the measurement scale. Now again, like this is a very subjective interpretation, and this is like, I'll be speaking more about that in the limitation part. But then I wanted to get a sense of understanding how do I even quote unquote measure this idea of perceived tenure security. So I try to kind of create this measurement scale where 1 defines the least perceived tenure security and 5 defines the highest. And depending on my interviews, hour-long interviews with different people in those communities, I have tried to measure across these different indicators. So my whole idea was I wanted to move from that continuum to a much more organic, complex, converting this complexity of indicators into some sort of a pattern which does not prioritize one over the other, which the ladder approach did. So this is what I tried to do. I mean, so this is Sarvodaya Nagar. For example, just if I look at a political patronage part indicator, so now it kind of scores high because the local residents, they have their own society which is formed and they have a great equation with the local councillor, local cooperator. And that is some sort of an assurance that the redevelopment and the kind of aspiration which that community has, they feel much more secure. They don't fear eviction. Whereas the market pressure is too high because they fear that they will be displaced in some other part because it's in prime part of the city. It is close to the railway station. It is close to hospitals and schools. So it fares a bit less on the market pressure part. So this is what I've tried to do. And then what I did eventually also was I kind of overlapped this web diagrams of all the 3 settlements. And the reason why I did was to understand how each settlement, each community needs to have a different perspective, how you kind of channelize your battles rather than always saying that this is the only way to make that or to give tenure or security to that particular settlement. Sometimes it has to be, or more often than sometimes it has to be an incremental approach by defining what is least tenure, what is like the easiest sort of a nut to crack, if I put it that way. So what I'm trying to say here is there are 2 characteristics of these indicators which are important to identify perceived tenure security. One is the intensity of each indicator, which can vary across, it can vary from different, it can vary across the settlement within the same city. And the dependency chain within this various indicators. So one does not overpower other. It has to be holistically evaluated what is the situation on ground. There is no chronology in this. That's why that you do not see the number. There is no ladder approach here. So what I'm trying to say here is, can this framework nudge activists, communities to better understand their settlements and kind of better calibrate their activism rather than, and I think sometimes because when the end goal is too demanding in state lingo, then can we have short-term crisis or like we overcome short-term crisis? For example, the biggest example on my all-time inspiration is Pani Haque Samiti, what they are doing in Mumbai. So their approach in like all the denotified slums were not given access to water. But then because of the fight and they went to the court and eventually it was approved and all these denotified they have right to access to water from the BMC. Now that is one step towards claiming some form of a tenure security because it is kind of recognized. So it is de facto. It does not give a complete tenure security, but it kind of builds that one step to kind of build another objective within that community. So also can this framework nudge policymakers, state representatives to think beyond a unidirectional solution of land titling or distribution of titles? For example, the slum networking project in Ahmedabad, they gave a 10-year no eviction guarantee with the basic services like water, electricity, street lights, without actually giving a document. And that kind of created a massive upgradation within the way that community shifted in 10 years or upgraded in 10 years. And then of course, this gives a range of like the moment we have this framework, we start thinking about different alternatives like self-redevelopment, communal titling, community land trusts, no eviction guarantees I was just talking about. And what are the limitations? So of course, this point actually reminds me of a conversation with Gautam a year back, because I think one of the ways I feel after reading much more is sometimes it is not also about always giving a representation. It can also be, these indicators can be a form of a checklist, which can be taken as a way which conveniently, according to the people who are working in those communities, and not all indicators, listed indicators can be in this conventional scale of low to high, because again, low to high is a perception. And I know, like more like an Inception movie, it's a perception of perception. So I also recognize that. And yeah, so just like a minute. And I think there are threats which are not perceptible also, because there are a lot of decisions which are made behind the closed doors, and a random news will come and it can completely disrupt that setting. So of course, the informed decision making would require a much more holistic understanding of what is de jure, de facto, and perceptions. And of course, it requires much more simple languages in colloquial ways which can be communicated and which can, calibrate that particular style. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rohit. That was very fascinating, and thank you for drawing attention to, the experience of tenure security for people and the various indicators that, draw attention to the pressures exerted beyond the law and really the politics, the shifting politics of our cities. Our final presentation for this panel is going to help us shift our gaze from the Delhi and Mumbai's and to the small towns of India, and invite Ritika and Arushi to present Unslumming the Slums, Deconstructing Slums as a Category in Small Town of India.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Ritika Rajput.
Hi, I'm Arushi.
Yeah, I'm an independent researcher, previously engaged with Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs as an Indian Smart City Fellow.
I'm a researcher at World Resources Institute, and we conducted the study about a year ago, and we'll just get right into it.
In 2013, Amitabh Kundu commented that the entire population in many of the smaller towns below 50,000 can be considered to be living in slums due to their poor living conditions. But that's not true. We don't believe in it. Slums in context of small towns have never been studied. Slums are considered as an indispensable feature of the global south urbanism and have been abundantly studied in megacities, Delhi, Mumbai. However, slums also exist in small towns as they do exist in megacities. Yet they remain understudied. For the first time in 2011, the Census Survey of India collated the slum data of all statutory towns, irrespective of their sizes. Out of 4,041 statutory towns, 2,543 towns, that is 63% of them, reported to have slums. Other way around. Yeah.
So now, what are the formation stories of these slums? How were these settlements categorized as slums in the first place? We're looking at three aspects: the governance aspect, the materiality, which is the physical evidence, and the ideological aspect here, which in this case deals with the identities of the residents. Here, we'll be looking at the governance through the lens of materiality, and we'll also be trying to engage with the identities of the settlements and their residents.
Yeah, to answer this question, we choose Bodh Gaya, a small but unique town from Bihar, where Buddha got enlightened. Bodh Gaya's global significance and dramatic transformation, especially post-liberalization, in 2002, Bodh Gaya got designated as a World Heritage Site. So far, this small town has 6 planning documents. These documents aspire for Bodh Gaya to be world-class. Apart from its international and religious popularity, this small town has also a history of evictions accompanied by several resettlement colonies. Yes, not actually found in small towns in general. Bodh Gaya's local economy is substantially anchored in agriculture, with around 65% of its land under agriculture and water bodies.
Now, we didn't approach these settlements with a normative stance of, assuming their labels in totality. Irrespective of whether they are called slums or not slums, we wanted to understand their formation stories. And therefore, it made sense to sort of take an ethnographic approach to this. We've taken some aspects of UN's definitions of slum to assess the materiality of these settlements. We've also noted the types of slums formulated by the Census of India for this.
So far we have 3 types of pre-existing data on slums from this small town. So the first one is the 2010 Bihar government's support program for urban reform, that is a SPUR data, which claims that around 55% of Bodh Gaya's slum population resides in slum, and where that's stripped me out as like, dekho kahan hai bhai. And the second is the Census Survey of India, which reported 46% of slums are in Bodh Gaya. And the third one is the most recent, that is the 2013 data by Bodh Gaya Nagar Parishad, that reported 27% of all settlements as slum, which is an individual scale data that we got from there. So it's around 1,600 households. According to this data, 80% of the residents of these slums belong to scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, that is Manjis and Musahars.
Now, with this information, we are going to start deconstructing these settlements to give you a sense of how we've sort of looked at the 3 aspects, so the governance, the materiality, and the identities. Most of Bodh Gaya's land was controlled by the Bodh Gaya Mutt, which is essentially a Shaivite monastic order, which was established in the late 16th century. In 1979, the Bihar government took over this land, including the land which was given by the Mutt to their workers.
And that land got divided into 3 parts. The first was the Gair Mazuria Arm, that's a public land. Second was Gair Mazuria Khas, Bihar government land. And Rayati, that's a private ownership land. And it is found that 76% of these slums, alleged slums, are actually on the Bihar government land. So that's the tenure issue.
So today this translates into insecure tenures who think that the land, which according to them is rightfully theirs, can be taken away by the Bihar government anytime. So to put it simply, they can be evicted without notice. Now we'll walk you through some of these settlements.
Yeah, so first is Rampur. It is a notified slum. So Rampur showed aesthetic characteristic of a rural Indian village containing large agriculture field, cattle, and spaced out home denoting low density. Our interlocutors reported that the residents of Rampur are engaged in agriculture and allied activities. Most of the land, including residential and agriculture, belong to Bihar government. That's a Gair Mazuria Khas. This means that there is no tenure security. Water pipelines haven't reached to the village. The residents are majorly dependent on the community hand pumps or private motor pumps. In terms of the sanitation, under the combined scheme of the state of Bihar, like the Chief Minister's Saath Nischay Yojana and the Center's Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, a total of 530 toilets have been constructed irrespective of the classifications of the settlement as slums and non-slums.
Now, you'll see a few pictures of Rajapur here. Now, residents of this slum settlement live in mud houses denoting rural characteristics rather than the overcrowded or dense slums. The mud houses are spaced out, and the settlement also has communal spaces, which is something that you don't generally see in the normal aesthetics of slums. It's also interesting to note that these mud houses are mostly occupied by the Manji community, which are a part of the SC community there. And the local government does not provide any basic amenities to the notified slum dwellers, except toilets to the many households. So a BJNP official casually noted that Rajapur would be wiped out as a part of the ongoing beautification of the world-class town, as Rajapur is located at the entrance of Bodh Gaya.
Yeah, and now you are looking at Mia Biga, which is not a slum. So Mia Biga is dominantly occupied by Mahadalits, and it was observed that its living conditions are undermining, like you can see. While being private land, in terms of sanitation and density, the area held more similarity with the typical definition and aesthetics of slum than our prior quoted examples, which begets the question of the true nature of characteristics considered by the government apparatus to categorize certain slums, certain settlements as slums and certain as non-slums.
You'll see pictures of old Tariri now. which is situated right behind the Mahabodhi temple. Old Tariri was the main village that, combined with a few others, and colloquially they are called tolas, gave birth to Bodh Gaya, the town that we know today. The present settlement is a remaining fragment of a village that got displaced in the end of 1970s as the government demarcated the boundary around the Mahabodhi temple and in some ways claimed it from the residents of Old Tariri. Now, according to the city development plan of 2011, a 1 kilometer buffer around the Mahabodhi temple is to be kept for maintaining the beauty and serenity of the main temple, which is, I'm quoting this from the draft master plan of 1966. The land is a Raiti land, which is private ownership. However, no water supply is given to the settlement. The households were dependent on the community tap outside the settlement that is not really accessible to them anymore because of the boundary created by the government to demarcate the community land, and most of the houses don't have toilets. Also, while they do technically have a security of tenure on paper, due to the formulation of the 1 kilometer buffer zone around the temple and their proximity to it, residents of Old Tariri are constantly in the fear of being evicted.
Yeah, so from Old Tariri to let's move to New Tariri. So Bhagalpur or New Tariri is a resettlement colony which came into being after the displacement of the Old Tariri in the late 1970s. The anguish of the displacement can still be felt in the residents of Bhagalpur. सरकार ने हमें वहाँ से हटा दिया मंदिर के लिए. अगर बुद्धा होता तो ऐसा कभी नहीं होता. So the government had displaced us from there for the temple. If Buddha was there, that would have never happened, said a 50-year-old resident of Bhagalpur. Interestingly, the settlement is a mixture of private and government land. New housing and commercial units are coming up on the vacant Bihar government land, that's a Gyan Mazuriya Khas, in the settlement that belonged to Mahant. A shopkeeper remarked to it, "Abhi hum log khali aise hi kabza kiye hain. We have just simply occupied it. The settlement has gotten pipelines, however, no water has reached the house line." You can see what is the condition out there.
Now, while the government apparatuses and parastatal schemes have their own classification and categorization of the settlements in Bodh Gaya, our ethnographic findings signaled an entirely different identity experienced by the residents of the said slums. All our interlocutors from all different designated settlements or slums said that their settlement is a village.
So in Bodh Gaya, we can say that slums are a result of complex intersectionality of historical land politics, which comes from the zamindari and land tenure insecurities, caste, and the lack of basic amenities.
So here's something that we're going to leave you with. So, एक गांव था और एक शहर है. शहर के शहरीकरण ने उस गांव को अपने कब्जे में किया और उस गांव को मलीन बस्ती का नाम दे दिया. पर क्या वो गांव सच में मलीन बस्ती है या वो आज भी एक गांव है?
So I read it out as, there was once a village, there was also a town. The town's urbanization absorbed the village in its boundary and called it a slum. But did that village really become a slum, or is it still a village? Thank you.
Thank you, Ritika and Arushi. That was very, very interesting. And really highlights how the category of slum that is, so easily used across contexts is it's challenging and leads. And I'm curious whether, in relation to Rohit's paper on perceived tenure security, if you could discuss a little bit about how this then reads into perceptions of tenure security, if that's something that you have thought of and engaged with, as well as the question of how do we understand this spatially, at the local scale and at the city scale. But maybe while you gather your thoughts, and maybe we can open up for question and answer, a round of questions. If there are any in the room, we could take a few and then. And if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Ishan. I have a couple of questions for Dikchha and for Ritika and Arushi. Dikchha, you made a distinction between formal and informal students I mean, I couldn't understand what was the point of that distinction if the living condition of all students, if they are not provided hostel accommodation by their institutes, is the same. And secondly, you mentioned about the increase of anti-social activities with increasing student presence. I mean, it's also an excuse that landlords use to extend paternalistic control over students. So just that, if you could reflect on that. Ritika and Arushi, I also have some similarities in my own work. So I was interested about what you guys think about Ghertner's work on rule by aesthetics on Delhi. How does it or does it not extend to your context? Because I am working in Banaras, and similar documents about turning the city into a world-class destination have come into place, specifically since the smart city plan and the prime minister being elected from there. And that has impacted boatmen specifically more than anyone else, who now have to contend and contest the incursion of cruise service into what they assert is their entitled occupation and their caste entitlement to rowboats on the river. Thank you.
So I'll start with the first initial part.
Should we take a few questions so that we can keep time as well?
So Jennifer here, I had one question for Rohit. I really like the way you talked about the de facto relations which are maintained by elected representatives and the communities. I just wanted to know from you that in the context of urban development, which takes place through various agencies and governments, often when there are central government policies of large-scale development projects, in that scenario, how do these relations operate? Do they break? Do they change in the sense of, especially large-scale projects? So then do evictions take place, or do these local relations still hold good? So that was what I wanted to ask you. And for Dikchha, also in the context of what Varun spoke about cooperative housing societies, what I was thinking is that not only in terms of affordability or in terms of availability for students, but there are also several other barriers often which cooperative housing society members set in terms of caste and religion, the identities of students who are wanting rental housing. So where do you see that fall, and what do you think could be the way in which these could be overcome? And also, do you think that, for example, policies like the PMAY's, affordable rental housing complexes, do you think these can be a solution for such kind of identity-based rent housing? Thanks.
I'll just add, there are a few more questions directed to Dikchha on student housing online. So one is, would affordable rental housing complex scheme be a viable model for student housing? And the next is, why is student housing mostly being considered a commercial activity? A strong policy on rental housing as residential would help the whole situation. And is are rental housing vouchers an option? There's also a question online for Malay from Surbi Malhotra on the question of allocation of housing to single women is now an important part of policies. Could you give some insights into what is happening at the ground level, what you came across during your research? And there's another question directed towards Rohit from Surbi as well. Could you elaborate on how gender impacts perceived security? I think we can, Dikchha, if you could start, thank you.
So I'll try to do it like one by one. Forgive me if I'm forgetting the sequence of questions. So to start with, why I did formal and informal student category is that because at least institutes take the responsibility, which are established under an act, like schools and colleges, take the responsibility of providing some kind of housing. while these coaching driven market does not it till at least till 2018-19 I could not figure out if they are even taking responsibility of giving housing and as an option to their students. Like we could trace like some of the institutes like Allen in Kota has come up with its own housing where they understood why giving housing to a student is equally important for their performance in the academic this thing. So therefore that is why, and even I could not I had to track back whether we have a definition regarding a student in any of the formal document in India. And it was really hard for me to get that definition itself. So my first curiosity was to understand we are not actually defining a student in Indian context. And while in Western, we just like India, in Western context also we have institutes like schools and colleges, but coaching is something which is very unique to Indian market. So my effort here is to get this thing also recognized somewhere, and say and to say per se that even market is driving a lot of housing in terms of needs. And in terms of education also, we need to recognize. Hence, I start my research this way. And then coming on to your next part, which was yes, social activity. This is a very prominent thing that I have come across during my even the later part of my research and my surveys and all. There is a biasness among for student rentals. Like even the owners want to have the govern the discipline of the students, and this is what students don't like. They have to be disciplined in terms of what they are monitored, in terms of what they are eating, what they are drinking, what is their timing, and all these things. This prejudice has always been there, and this is what is now getting acknowledged and understood. And in our market, where we are coming up with purpose-built student accommodation, like Zolo, Stanza Living, Oyo, and all these people are coming into student accommodation where they are published. Even this answers your question also, where these people are advertising and telling students that we are not going to ask you your ethnicity, your gender, but we are going to give you a housing, and you will have a minimum interaction with your owner. You just need to pay rent. But where we are trying, this formal market is trying to solve that problem, where students want minimum interference in their private life. This is the quality of life they are trying to portray here. But then this again gives a bigger picture or bigger question to the society, that will it end the kind of troubles or the problems that are coming up, or will it lead to certain other problems, be it psychologically or sociologically, in terms of then there are studies in terms of kind of depression students are getting into, and when they are isolated this way. So there's a lot of complex understanding, and it's very interesting as we get into this study. And I think like if you can just recall the online questions that we have.
I think part of it you have sort of already addressed about policies, and so ERHCs, for example, would that be a viable model? And the other one is about student housing being considered a commercial activity versus a residential activity.
Yeah, so again, true, like affordable rental accommodation kind of model also. We are trying to address somewhere, but government will somehow government always focuses upon the marginalized group or the low income group, and certain higher income and middle income groups are always catered by the market market drivers. So we have to rely on these things, but then again we might lead into various other problem of inflation and gentrification and all these things. So this is something which has to be researched, and we need to come out with the very interesting facts out there, I think.
Thank you. We can, I think we can go in order of how we're seated. Rohit, if you could in 2 minutes, so that everyone gets a chance to really respond to the comments.
Yeah. So on your question, so you asked about like large scale policies, projects, mega projects, how they affect the internal relations and the dynamics. So I think like the two immediate projects come to my mind is the Dharavi redevelopment, which is now proposed in Mumbai. So there was this railway land which actually went, and then the tendering happened again, and railways is a central government land. So, or the Bombay Port Trust, where a massive overhaul is happening, and there are a lot of communities who served Bombay Port Trust for like more than 50, 60 years, and now there is a displacement there. So I think the way I would answer is it's a complex phenomenon, because there are a lot of these intra relations. If they are not strong enough, if they are easily incentivized within those hierarchies and power structures, those relations will break down. So what the tenure security will be perceived. It also depends on the aspirational mapping which needs to be done. For example, there will be a particular community which will have certain kind of aspiration which is met by that particular project, but we can discuss this more. So on the gender, how gender impacts perceived security, I think for me, like based on my limited experience, I have seen the places where there are self-help groups, where there are women who are, for example, Pukar, the presentation which we saw, there are women who are working in Pukar, and they are this fellowship program where people who are living, they are also employed. So I think in those kinds of communities, the voice is much more sort of inspired and taken by other women and other self-help groups also. So their demand and their perceived tenure security is impacted in that particular way. But yeah, it's a deeper question. So it's like Ruchika has given me a very limited time. So.
Ritika, Arushi, 2 minutes.
Yeah. To answer Jishan's question about the applicability rule by aesthetics. So when Arushi told us Rajapur will be wiped out, or Old Tariri is vulnerable, and they perceived perceived tenure security, but I said perceived tenure insecurity. They have the private land, but they have this perceived tenure insecurity. So it's fundamentally because these settlements situate near the Mahabodhi temple. And what happened to them depends on the bigger picture to what will happen to the Mahabodhi. So yes, it does rule by aesthetics to some extent. And Arushi has something to add on.
Yeah, so through the last aspect of our study, so the ideological aspect, we were also trying to look at the aesthetics of slums, not just the physicality of it, but also how it's perceived. So we're just questioning how the governance apparatus in the first place have, classified them as slums in the first place, on what basis, on what aesthetics. And at the same time, the aspect of how the residents of these settlements view themselves, whether it's not a great condition or whether it's a village-like condition, irrespective of anything, they do see themselves as villagers. So it also has a historical dynamic to it. So yeah, I hope this helps.
Thank you. For folks online, Malay, if you could respond to the question, and then we can come to Panki and Varun for comments as well.
Yeah, so I think in our Delhi fieldwork, we don't encounter we don't meet with such instances where single women got allotment later. But in another study in Bhubaneswar and Kochi, there were few instances where allotment given to the single individual woman.
Thank you, Ismail. Any closing comments?
Yeah, so I just want to add some comments on Dikchha Tiwari's question. So I have studied rental housing market discrimination in Calcutta during my doctoral research, and I have also found that specifically bachelor tenants, student bachelors, so they face very serious issues in rental housing access in the rental market. Okay, so even recently enacted MTA, Model Tenants Act, doesn't recognize these issues in these policies. So I think side-by-side policy implementation as well as sensitization is very much needed in the rental market to overcome these issues. Yeah.
Thank you. And Punky and Varun, if Punky, you could start, we could respond to each other's papers, and also I think make a little bit of sense of how do we understand Mumbai from other cities, or how can other cities sort of help us understand Mumbai, the housing in Mumbai, if we could make some cross connections as well.
Yeah, something that just, came to my mind when I was hearing Varun's presentation particularly. I mean, his talks about the paradox of the cooperative housing society movement as such, and mine also talks about the paradox of rent control. Both of these began as, bearing non-commodified notions of housing, and they eventually, end up becoming very integrated with the commodified system of housing. And I think that one of the elements which also adds to the commodification in the cooperative housing sector would be the fact that the leave and license system, grew within this sector. It thrived within the cooperative housing society. So that could also be seen as one of the things that has led to the commercialization of, or a lot of private investment in the flats, in the self-contained flats of cooperative housing society, because you are able to then bypass the rent control restrictions as such. Just one thing that I would want to say is that the normal discourse, the mainstream discourse generally talks of the growth of cooperative housing society, or the emergence of it in context of Mumbai. It's because of the Rent Act, the Bombay Rent Act. I mean, that's generally the trajectory, which is the argument which is made. Perhaps we could append that kind of, an argument and start thinking about how the encouragement of commodification, the normalization of commodification has led to the cooperative housing model becoming what it is today, to the commercialization, to its commercialization avatar. So while I do agree that rent control has, there is a lot which can be said about the problems created by rent control, but to state that that is the cause, of these problems, while downplaying or in fact even ignoring the fact that, after all, rent control was supposed to be a palliative measure, and the entire idea, even in the legislative debates, was that along with rent control, you have to build a larger stock of public housing. Yeah, the fact that we did not achieve that in Mumbai, and the cooperative housing society, its commercialized model came to fill in that space, talks not so much about rent control failures as such, but as the failure of just establishing housing as at the forefront of social policy in the city. Yeah, I'm done. Thanks.
Thanks, Paki, for those comments. I think there were a few things that I sort of skipped over just to, for brevity, and I think a lot of what you say is very pertinent in that the Rent Act is often sort of cited as a causative factor behind the commercialization of cooperative housing, but actually one of the main factors behind it, at least sort of retrospectively, seems to be that a lot of these migrant communities which moved in realized that they didn't have to restrict themselves to creating housing as a public good and only for affordable housing, and they realized that there was an opportunity to develop a modus operandi where they could simply invite anybody in and get them to buy into an ownership flat. And I think there was a sentiment, as you said, when the Bombay Rent Act and when the cooperative system came in, there was a sentiment of, for creating housing as a public good. And this idea of real estate was simply not there. That having been said, so our paper is trying to sort of chart that journey of cooperative housing. I did want to draw a parallel between the Pagdi system and cooperative housing, because in the 50s and 60s, when the Rent Control Act was still in place, and people were, I think a lot of prospective buyers were had these two options of buying into an ownership flat and buying into a Pagdi system, which is what actually made the ownership of a flat so much more lucrative for them, because with the Pagdi system, they didn't always get the benefits of owning a flat and being able to alienate it as they pleased. I think somebody in the audience raised something about cooperative housing societies exercising a lot of influence on who gets to stay within their premises. I think that also has a longer history, because when the British brought in the cooperative housing acts, it was a reflection of how they saw the Indian population, and because they saw them as these communities, and so they had no problems with people coming forward, or investors or promoters coming forward and developing housing societies which were meant only for Brahmins, or meant only for Saraswat Brahmins, or only for particular kinds of communities. And I think that because that sort of strain which was present within cooperative housing societies at its point of origin within India, since it wasn't challenged at that point, it sort of continues to this day. I mean, even today in Bombay, there are cooperative housing societies which won't let members of other communities stay there. So I think that that sort of behavior has an older history. As far as what Bombay can teach other cities, I think the way or sort of the physical forms, like the apartment building, which sort of came to Bombay, I think that's one of the, to my mind at least, one of the most understudied parts of the urban scape of most Indian cities. But it originated in Bombay, and a lot of the innovations around these apartment buildings has taken place in Bombay, and I don't think it's been sort of well, not all its aspects have been studied enough, especially because we often talk about housing within the global south as there's a lot of focus on informal housing, but I think that cooperative housing or apartment housing and it's middle class, upper middle class, lower middle class residents are, I think, as much sort of actors in sort of deciding how places look within Indian cities, and they have such a hegemonic sort of relationship with other residents of the city in so many ways that I think some of those are can be understudied, and yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Varun. Gautam, you.
Hi, folks. Thank you all for those set of papers. I had just two comments to offer, and question as to the first paper with Malay and Ismail and others. I just wanted to think about whether you can consider delay judicial grounds that communities can use in order to challenge the process in court. As you know, that many housing rights organizations, particularly in Delhi, like the Delhi Housing Rights Task Force, you said housing delayed is housing denied, right? And the parallel to that is justice delayed is justice denied. But a lot of these eviction cases are basically fighting in court, and we are part of those court battles. And one of the grounds that we have is not used basically is for delay to be a ground to reverse things like not use vacant flats, etc., separate from the housing rights argument, separate from the fundamental rights argument. So just a thought of whether delay can be a judicial ground for resistance for movements, and whether your work can offer that as a grounds of empirical evidence of that. I'm thinking of parallels under the Narega Act, where delay is a grounds for compensation, even thinking beyond just rehabilitation, restitution. And thanks for that. Varun, I wanted to just say that I think that it's really interesting to hear your and Dr. Agrawal's work next to each other, just because of the way you read commodification and decommodification so nicely between the acts. I wanted to actually for both of you to suggest a little bit, because what I think is really interesting is that there is the world of rental housing that rental control mechanisms and markets describe, and then there's the lived reality of rental housing within low-income informal rent. And the idea actually is that a lot of low-income rental is cooperative, not by legal definition, but in practice. Because the question of being able to, for example, occupy a post-eviction resettlement colony, nobody has the single-use capital to enter into building on a new plot given to the city. So often that money is precisely pooled across 4 plots, but not with cooperative agreements, not citing the act, not registering a society. But actually in practice, there are deep forms of trust and organizational behavior. So the provocation, actually just hearing your work, is what would it mean to imagine the cooperative outside law? What would it mean to imagine the cooperative as a housing practice in the southern city that actually has deep and wide roots and has never required or needed the legal sanction? So what could formal cooperative housing learn from existing cooperative practices? And is there something that a kind of legal recognition could help the kind of informal cooperative housing that we see? Colleagues in our housing team have been saying that it's in rental housing for domestic workers. They actually say the household or the house makes no sense as a unit. So they use the category of setup. Now, I'm interested in what a setup is vis-a-vis a cooperative. It's collective, the infrastructure is shared, the tenure is shared, there are mixed agreements, the money is pooled in at some point. And so just to think a little bit about drawing the idea of non-individual, non-ownership housing that the cooperative allows, but through practice. So thank you very much for both of those.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're at time. Thank you everyone for your fascinating presentations and the discussion, and everyone for their questions and comments.